After I signed a 50-page breakup agreement with my ex, my brain went flatlined. Like no thoughts, just the soft dead hum of a fax machine. So I did what any emotionally stable adult does. I went online to commit a little social arson. I posted on a local Haven sport forum, one of those verified residents-only boards where people argue about parking permits and suspicious coyotes. Post title: got rejected, got dumped, now accepting applications for a boyfriend with the same IQ as me. Post body: must provide an official neuropsych eval, score under 90, if you're too smart you'll make me feel bad and I'll bite. 2 minutes later a guy slid into my inbox. His name was Dashel, and he called himself a certified dumbass with a kind of casual ease that suggested he'd made peace with it long ago. When his photo came through, wet hair, water dripping off his collarbone, shirt clinging in all the right places, a very disrespectful set of abs trying to escape the fabric like inmates. My throat did that stupid tight thing and my tongue stuck to the roof of my mouth. I told him I hated people who bullied dumbasses, which made him say I was the first person who hadn't laughed. I should have logged off right then. I didn't. The backstory was this. My ex, Cyrus Whitlock, Gold Star attorney and professional human deposition, had ended our 2-year relationship with a 50-page binder, color-coded tabs, highlighted paragraphs, and a spreadsheet conclusion that I owed him $6,666 in emotional damages. He'd itemized affection loss by fiscal quarter. He'd flagged my dramatic tendencies as boundary violations. He'd confessed, almost as a footnote, that he'd blurred lines with a coworker, been emotionally unavailable, and broken a promise he'd made in writing, but he calculated his own liability at a fraction of mine. I didn't argue the number. I paid him $10,000 instead, with a note that said, "Congratulations, please go haunt someone else." I had meant it as a power move. My therapist later said it was dissociation, probably both. So I swore off intelligent men forever, posted a joke ad on a neighborhood forum, and somehow ended up lying on my side in the dark, cheek pressed to my pillow, texting a beautiful stranger who told me his elderly guardian had found him as an infant outside a hospital, raised him on secondhand income and stubborn love, and that people had been treating him as disposable his entire life. I'd barely processed that when my boss dragged me into a video call with the Munich parent company. I was the company's in-house German interpreter, which sounded impressive until you remembered I was doing it in corporate hell for a salary that barely cleared my parking fees. Halfway through the call, a man appeared on screen who hadn't been in the briefing notes. Suit like armor, jaw like a verdict, eyes that had never once considered finding anything funny. His name, according to the chat sidebar, was Graham Pritchard. Crow, my colleague, mouthed silently through the frozen smile on her camera. Law partner to the CEO. Absolute monster. And a second message appeared right after. Rumor is his fiancée left him. I watched Graham Pritchard dismantle 4 executives in 40 minutes without raising his voice once. He didn't argue. He just waited, let people finish their sentences, and then restructured their entire logic so efficiently that by the end they were agreeing with positions they'd started out opposing. It was the most terrifying thing I'd ever witnessed in a professional setting, and I had once watched Cyrus cross-examine a man into crying. After the call ended and my camera clicked off, I sat in the silence of my home office with my phone buzzing and Dashel's messages stacking up, and I thought about the particular danger of men who were very, very good at making you feel like you'd already lost. Dashel and I texted for 3 weeks before we met in person, and when we did, it was at a food truck festival near the harbor where he ate 2 full portions of something grilled, laughed too loud at his own jokes, and looked at me with the uncomplicated warmth of a person who had decided simply and completely that I was worth looking at. He was funny in the way people are when they've survived something and chosen joy anyway. He was not dumb. That was the thing I figured out slowly, like a fog lifting. He was not formally educated. He had never finished high school, had tested badly on every standardized measure because of a processing disorder no one had diagnosed until he was 19, had spent years believing the story that slow on paper meant broken in practice. He wasn't broken. He was one of the sharpest, most emotionally precise people I'd ever met. He just didn't know words like fiduciary or liability. He knew people. He knew me. Faster than I was comfortable with. We were 2 months in when I ran into Graham Pritchard at a charity gala my company had forced me to attend. He was standing near the bar like a wall that had decided to develop opinions, and when our eyes met across the room, something clicked in his expression that I couldn't name. We'd never spoken directly on any of the calls. I was the interpreter, invisible infrastructure. But he crossed the room toward me with the focused efficiency of someone executing a plan, introduced himself with my name first, and said he'd heard my German was flawless, which was not a compliment so much as a file note spoken aloud. I told him it paid the bills. He asked what else paid the bills. I told him none of his business. He smiled. It was the first time I'd seen him do it, and it was devastating. I went home and told Dashel about the encounter, lying on his couch with my feet in his lap, and he listened with that particular stillness he had. The kind that meant he was actually paying attention instead of just waiting for his turn to speak. He said the man sounds like he wants something from you and you should figure out what it is before he does. I told him he was paranoid. He said he wasn't, he just noticed things. He wasn't wrong. Graham started appearing at a coffee shop near my office. At the next company call, this time addressing me by name when he needed something translated, creating a professional thread between us that felt deliberately woven. He began emailing me directly. Small things at first. A clarification request, a document flag, then longer, then late in the evenings. He was interesting in a way that made me angry because I didn't want him to be. He was precise and cold, and occasionally, in the gaps between sentences, something else showed through. Something unguarded that he snapped shut the moment he noticed it. I mentioned none of this to Dashiell, which was its own kind of betrayal. The actual betrayal came in the form of a manila envelope. Dashiell had been staying at my apartment for 3 weeks when it arrived, slid through the mail slot on a Tuesday morning. Inside was a printed dossier, photographs, documents, a 2-page letter on law firm letterhead. It was from Cyrus. He had apparently spent the months since our breakup conducting what could only be described as a private investigation into my life, and what he'd found, or what he constructed, was a narrative in which I had been emotionally unfaithful throughout our relationship, had manipulated him deliberately, and was now engaged in a fraudulent romantic relationship with a man he'd flagged, in actual legal language, as a person of interest in a separate civil matter. Cyrus had sent the same envelope to my employer, to the Munich parent company, and to Dashiell. I found out about Dashiell's copy because he came home while I was still standing in the kitchen shaking, set his keys on the counter with that careful quietness he had, and said he needed to tell me something. He'd received a package. He'd read it. He wanted to hear my side before he decided anything. The fact that he said that, before he decided anything, instead of immediately believing the worst, cracked something open in my chest that I was not prepared for. I told him everything. The $10,000. The spreadsheets. The coworker Cyrus had minimized into a footnote. The ways I had quietly dismantled myself trying to be legible to a man who only understood people as arguments to be won. Dashiell listened. Then he said, "So your ex is trying to burn your life down because you stopped owing him something?" I said yes. He said, "Okay." He said, "Let's think about what we're going to do." What we did was this. I called Graham Pritchard. Not because I trusted him. Because I understood him now, the way you understand a weapon you've decided to pick up rather than avoid. He answered on the second ring, and I told him I needed a conversation that was not about the company. There was a pause. Then he said he'd been waiting for me to call. I told him I knew. I told him Cyrus had made a move that touched his firm's name, because one of the documents in the dossier had referenced a case that connected back to Graham's client roster. A detail Cyrus had apparently included as leverage and not understood was also exposure. Graham's silence on the other end of the line was the silence of a man recalculating. I let him sit in it. Then I said I wasn't asking for a favor. I was identifying a shared problem and suggesting we address it efficiently. He said that was the most lawyer thing a non-lawyer had ever said to him. I said I'd had an education. He said he knew. I said I know you know. And then we talked for 2 hours. What followed took 6 weeks and was, from the outside, completely invisible. Graham's firm filed a motion in a case that had nothing visibly to do with Cyrus, but which had everything to do with a client Cyrus had been quietly misrepresenting for 3 years. The filing created a discovery chain. The discovery chain reached a financial record. The financial record invalidated the emotional damages claim Cyrus had built his entire post-breakup narrative around. Every spreadsheet, every highlighted paragraph, every color-coded tab, collapsed into inadmissible garbage because the underlying financial model had been built on numbers Cyrus had known were wrong. My employer received a correction letter. The Munich company received a formal statement of error. Cyrus received a bar association inquiry. I received nothing except the quiet. The night it was over, Dashiell made dinner at my apartment, the kind of meal that involved too many ingredients and a complete disregard for the recipe. And we sat on the floor because the table had files on it, and he said, "You know you're terrifying, right?" I asked why. He said because you called the scariest man in the building and used him like a scalpel. I told him I'd learned from watching bad men be effective and decided to be more efficient than them. He looked at me for a long time. Then he said, "When I got that envelope, for about 10 minutes I believed it. I want you to know that. 10 minutes. And then I remembered every single time you looked at me like I was the answer to a question you didn't know you'd been asking. And I thought, no. Someone who looks at a person like that doesn't do what that letter said." I didn't say anything. I put my fork down. He said, "I'm not smart the way you're smart, but I know people. And I know you. And I'm not going anywhere." I started crying in a way I hadn't since the binder, except this time it didn't feel like flatline. It felt like something that had been held underwater finally surfacing, finally breathing, finally allowed to be loud. Graham Pritchard sent me one final email 3 months later. Short, professional. It said he hoped the matter had resolved to my satisfaction,
and that he would be recusing himself from any future calls involving my company.
Out of an abundance of caution. The last line read,
For what it's worth, your instincts are exceptional. You should be on the right side of the table.
I read it twice, then I forwarded it to Dashiell with no comment. He replied 40 seconds later with one word. Told. I laughed so hard I knocked my coffee over. Cyrus received his bar inquiry result 4 months after the dossier. The finding was formal. The consequence was real. I heard about it through a mutual contact, who delivered the news with the satisfied tone of someone who'd been waiting to make that call. I thanked her and hung up and sat with it for a moment and felt almost nothing, which was exactly what winning actually felt like after you'd stopped needing it. The wanting it phase had lasted 2 years. The letting go phase took about 30 seconds, and a man on a couch who'd asked to hear my side before he decided anything. I never did find out who Graham Pritchard's ex-fiancée was or why she'd left, but sometimes when he appeared on a company call, still hard-jawed, still cutting everything in half, I'd notice the very occasional flicker of something unresolved around his eyes, and I'd think, I hope you figure it out, you terrifying, useful man. And then I'd go home to Dashiell, who would be halfway through building something he'd found a tutorial for, surrounded by the wrong tools, completely unbothered, grinning at me over his shoulder like I was the best thing that happened to him, and I would think about all the forms intelligence takes. How it looks like a binder sometimes, and like a spreadsheet, and like a cold man in a good suit, but mostly, it looks like someone who refuses to believe the worst of you before they've even asked.